Ciao a tutti, come state, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking all about Italian, or, the Telugu of the West. Now, as far as which dialect I'll be using myself, it'll be Northern Italian, since the native Italian speakers I talk to the most are from the north. But I'll address the dialectal differences in the phonology section, so let's go! So of course we're going to start with the history, but fair warning, this history section will be more confusing than normal. Italian, or Italiano, is an Italo-Romance language in the Indo-European language family. As you can probably guess, it starts with the Romans who started the Roman Republic in 509 BC in Rome, which of course is in what we'd now call Italy, but initially they were just in Rome the city. The rest of the peninsula had other people, most notably the Etruscans, who lived a bit to the north in what's now Tuscany, or Toscana. Sound familiar? And spoke a completely unrelated language, although there was some influence. The Roman Republic wouldn't actually conquer all of what's now Italy until 172 BC, and then they expanded to the whole Mediterranean region and then some, became an empire in 27 BC, peaked in 117 AD, and fell in 476 AD, you know the drill. But what happened next in Italy? Yeah, here's the confusing part. This is normally where I talk about the historical stages in a language involving words like old and middle, but Italian doesn't really have those. At the end of the Roman Empire, speakers on the Italian peninsula had a dialect continuum of Vulgar Latin, which gradually drifted apart over time throughout the various disunified sovereignties that controlled Italy over the centuries, while still heavily influencing one another. We now know these as the languages of Italy, or sometimes Italian dialects, even though it's technically wrong. But which one do we know as Italian? That would be Florentine, out of Florence, the capital of Tuscany, which is proving to be a very important region in this video. Basically, there was a tradition of literature in Tuscany in the Middle Ages, and it got formalized due to a writer named Dante Alighieri, who was from Florence, and wrote a series of epic poems about the afterlife collectively called Commedia, published in 1321. Divina Commedia, as it later be known, became very famous throughout Italy, and as a result, Florentine became the variety out of the Italian languages that you were expected to know as an educated Italian. In the following centuries, Italian, as it's now known, gradually replaced Latin as the official language of most of the regions of Italy. And then in 1871, Italy completed its unification process, and naturally, Italian was the official language, even though less than 3% of the population could speak it at the time. But that number has grown while Italy's been unified. Today, Italian is the official language of Italy, San Marino, and Vatican City, an official language in Switzerland and 3 subnational entities in other countries, and a recognized minority language in 6 countries. In terms of speakers, about 65 million people speak Italian as a native language, and about 3 million speak it as a second language, adding up to approximately 68 million total speakers. Good enough for it to have the 23rd most native speakers and the 30th most total speakers in the world. So then how does Italian sound? Let's take a look at the phonology. Overall, Italian has 7 vowels and 22 consonants, totaling 29 phonemes. Let's start with the consonants. First and foremost, Italian has phonemic consonant gemination, so consonants can get held for twice as long, and it may make a difference in meaning. Hear the difference between pala and palla. That being said, there are 5 consonants in Italian that are automatically geminated in intervocalic position, those being ly, ñ, sh, t, and z. The reason for this is that those consonants evolved from clusters in Latin, so they already had the length of 2 consonants, or to be academic about it, they were already bimeraic. For example, coniglio, prugna, and pesce. The last 2 of that list, the voiceless and voiced alveolar affricates, are a bit more interesting because I was actually struggling to figure out whether I should count z as its own phoneme, or just an allophone of, or in free variation with, t. And while it's very marginal, there's apparently one example of an exact minimal pair between them, that being razza, race of people, and razza, stingray, so I have to count it as a phoneme. But don't get too sad about the lack of allophones in Italian, because there is one. At least in northern Italy, s becomes z when between vowels and not geminated, like in casa. Compare this with rosso, where the s is geminated and therefore still voiceless. S also becomes z before a voiced consonant, like in sbagliato. So now let's talk about vowels. It's not that challenging, there's 7 of them, with no reduction, although there is the thing that the 2 open mid-vowels e and o can only appear in stressed syllables. Here's what's interesting though, Italian does have vowel length distinction, but it's not phonemic. It's an allophone based on whether the following consonant is geminated or not, just like we talked about in the Swedish video. Mandatory shout out to K. Klein here as well. They work in tandem. If there's a geminated consonant, the vowel before it will be short, but if the consonant is ungeminated, the vowel will be long, like we saw earlier with pala versus palla. And finally, for the phonology, something y'all may have noticed about Italian words, they all end in vowels. Well, almost all of them. The only exceptions are certain short function words that end with n, r, or l, like con, per, or il, a few recent loanwords like hotel, and weirdest of all, the cardinal directions nord, est, sud, and ovest. And yeah, you could say this is expected because they're Germanic loanwords, but Italian's relative Spanish borrowed the same words, while now in Spanish, 3 of those words end in vowels, despite Spanish's somewhat less restrictive attitude towards words ending with consonants. Honestly, this whole idea that Spanish and Italian are sort of using each other's cardinal directions was one of my biggest surprises when I was learning Italian. So we've seen Italian phonology, now it's time to find out how all that is represented in the orthography. Italian uses its own version of the Latin alphabet with 21 letters, of which there are 5 vowels and 16 consonants. You may also find ilunga, kappa, v doppia, x, and y in loanwords. So let's start with the consonants again, and specifically with one of the problematic parts of Italian writing. Remember that whole t and z thing I was talking about? Yeah, it's not represented, they both use zeta. However, due to both the overwhelming dominance of voiceless t and the fact that those two sounds almost never phonemically contrast, this shouldn't really be a problem outside of ichthyologists writing academic papers about le razze delle razze or something like that. So now other stuff about consonants. Like with all the Romance languages I know, the letters G and G change pronunciation depending on the following vowel. When followed by E or E, they're pronounced J and J respectively, while anywhere else they're pronounced G and G. But in addition, if the digraph SC is before E or E, it's pronounced Sh, while otherwise it's just Sk like you'd expect. Also, be aware that sometimes Ch, J, or Sh may occur phonetically before a vowel other than A or E, and in this case, a silent E is added after the consonant to indicate this, like in ghiaccio. But also in this word, notice the GH at the beginning. Simply adding H is how you'd negate this pattern and give the consonants their hard pronunciation, also demonstrated in chiesa. In fact, outside of loanwords and certain conjugations of avere, that's H's only job in Italian. And since we're talking about digraphs and multigraphs, let's keep doing that because Italian has quite a few. Outside of those just discussed, there's also GLE for lie, the E could be silent, and GN for nye. Also, it's not really a digraph, but you should know that ku is always followed by u, and that combination is always pronounced gue. But you know what else causes digraphs? That's right, consonant gemination. It's indicated in writing by simply doubling the consonant, and naturally this also indicates a short vowel beforehand. Speaking of which, let's move on to vowels, which are a bit more problematic. For one, the letters e and o both have double duty in stressed syllables, with e representing both e and e, while o represents both o and o, and you'll just have to learn them individually when one of those letters is stressed. But can diacritics help with that? In theory, yes, but they're severely underutilized. You see, in unaccented Italian words, the stress could go on either the penultimate syllable or the antepenultimate syllable, and the only trick I've ever figured out for that is do whatever Spanish does. So what are the diacritics? The one you'll see most of is the grave or l'accento grave, which indicates stress in the last syllable, like in città, caffè, and più. It's also sometimes used for disambiguation of two otherwise identical words, but technically, the grave is used for the specifically open mid-vowels e and o when used on their letters. For the close mid-vowels e and o, in theory you'd instead use the acute or l'accento acuto, but you'll pretty much only see it used on the word perché. Otherwise, there's rarely a need for it, although there are 2 disambiguation examples I know of. Finally, there's capitalization for sentences and names, and that should cover the orthography. Now it's time for the grammar, so let's see that sentence structure. Italian's default word order is SVO, or subject, verb, object. For a basic example sentence, we have Il passero raccoglie dei semi. This means the sparrow collects seeds. Word for word, it's article, subject, verb, article, object, SVO. However, as with other Romance languages, if the object is a pronoun and the verb is neither infinitive nor imperative, then it'll move before the verb, becoming an SOV sentence. So if I just wanted to say the sparrow collects them, then that'd be Il passero li raccoglie. In addition, questions can move the verb to the beginning of the sentence, so as a question, our sentence would be raccoglie il passero dei semi. Although you could totally just raise your pitch at the end of an SVO sentence too. So now for other parts of Italian sentence structure. Adjectives generally go after their nouns, except for a select group of frequent adjectives which go before. All numbers go before their noun, and the language uses prepositions, the ones that go before the noun phrase. Finally, Italian is pro-drop, so subject pronouns are normally not needed. So now we'll move on to nouns. Italian nouns are inflected for 2 numbers, singular and plural, and divided into 2 genders, masculine and feminine. Differentiating between the genders is, for the most part, pretty easy. Masculine nouns normally end with o, like giorno and lupo, while feminine nouns end with a, like vacca and spiaggia. Of course, there are exceptions like mano, which looks masculine but is feminine, and problema, which looks feminine but is masculine. And there are also nouns ending with e, which could be either, like how mese and fulmine are masculine but volpe and notte are feminine. Luckily though, if the word ends with the suffix ione, then you'll know it's feminine like soluzione and direzione. So then how do the nouns pluralize? It's not too hard. Nouns ending with o mostly pluralize to i, like giorno to giorni and lupo to lupi, and the feminine noun mano also does this, pluralizing to mani. Nouns ending with e, regardless of gender, also pluralize to i, like mese to mesi, notte to notti, and direzione to direzioni. On the other hand, feminine nouns ending with a pluralize to e, like tazza to tazze. By the way, both the earlier examples I used to show feminine nouns pluralize regularly, but they involve spelling changes. Vacca becomes vacche with an H to prevent the k from becoming soft, while spiaggia becomes spiagge because with the final vowel now being e instead of a, the silent e is no longer necessary. You'll have to keep stuff like this in mind when writing in Italian. Now, there are two exceptions to the a to e rule. First, the irregularly masculine a nouns pluralize to e like the regular masculine noun, so problema becomes problemi. Also, nouns ending with a stressed a don't change in the plural, like città to città. And then there's that one super weird group of exceptions. Some masculine nouns, mostly body parts that were historically neuter, have singular forms ending with o, but pluralized to a form ending with a. And due to the association that Italians have with a endings in the feminine gender, those plurals are feminine, like how braccio, masculine, pluralizes to braccia, feminine. But in addition, some of those nouns also have non-body part alternative meanings, and for those, the plural is regular and still masculine. So if you're talking about a branch of a river, for example, the plural form is bracci. And here's the other mandatory cake line shout out. And finally for nouns, Italian does not have cases. Now let's talk about the articles. Italian has both definite and indefinite articles. At first glance, the definite articles look like this, which isn't too hard, but they are subject to a good amount of allomorphy. First off, if the following word, which isn't always the noun, begins with a vowel, the singular definite article will change from either il or la to l with an apostrophe, like in l'aeroporto or loca. But also, if a masculine singular noun starts with the so-called impure consonant or cluster, most famously esse followed by another consonant, the article will change from il to lo, like in lo spazio and lo squalo. And for masculine nouns, if either of the above situations applies, then the plural definite article will change from I to gli, giving us gli aeroporti and gli squali, and making the feminine plural definite article le the only one that stays constant. So now here are the indefinite articles, literally just the word for one, but they have similar allomorphs to the definite articles. Masculine un becomes uno before those word initial impurities, like uno scoiattolo, for example. Meanwhile, feminine una becomes un with an apostrophe before a vowel, like in unoca. So what if you want to pluralize an indefinite article? Well, then you'd have to use a partitive article, meaning some, which are basically just the definite articles combined with the preposition di, meaning of. All the allomorphs still apply, by the way. And while we're on this subject, Italian articles also combine with these four other prepositions. It's pretty cool, even if not as easy to memorize as the Portuguese system. And finally, Italian has 2 degrees of demonstrative articles / pronouns. Questo for proximal this and these, and quello for distal that and those. Both those terms also agreeing with their noun for gender and number. Speaking of pronouns, let's talk about them. Here's the big chart of Italian pronouns, and we'll see what we notice. First off, the chart is organized into the subject pronouns, the verbal objects, and the prepositional objects. The difference between these latter two groups should be pretty easy to understand. These go before verbs or after in the infinitive and imperative, and these go after prepositions. Now let's talk more about the peculiarities of the verbal object pronouns. First off, if there are 2 of them on one verb in a sentence, the first one, which indicates the indirect object, will change its vowel from e to e, like in the sentence te l'ho detto, I told you it. There's te instead of t. Also, if they're before a vowel, they may elide, becoming their first letter followed by an apostrophe, although this is generally not done in the North or informal writing. By the way, the e to e change and the elision both apply to si, which is the reflexive pronoun. Moving on, look at the third person pronouns and notice how there are 2 forms for them. This is Italian's only accusative dative distinction, also known as direct object versus indirect object. The direct objects are the words you may almost recognize from the article section, lo, la, li, and le, while the indirect objects are gli, le, confusingly, and also gli for plural. Speaking of the third person, for the subject pronouns, it should be mentioned that lui, lei, and loro have older forms of egli, ella, and elli or elle, but just the ones I wrote on the chart are used nowadays mostly. They got imported from their original role as the prepositional objects. So now let's talk a bit about honorifics. Italian used to have TV distinction, that thing where the second person plural pronoun replaces the singular one to show more respect, but then it went through a bit of a process. First, Italian took the path of Spanish and Portuguese and lengthened the honorific to la magnificenza vostra, or vossignoria, meaning respectively your magnificence and your lordship. But then Italians just started referring to those phrases with the pronoun, so formal you is now lei, the word for she, since magnificenza and signoria are both grammatically feminine. And by extension, loro is now the plural formal pronoun. And finally, here are the possessive pronouns. They inflect like adjectives and generally go before the noun phrase, but there's something important to know. You have to put the appropriate definite article before the possessive for it to be grammatical. So for example, you can't just say mio gatto, you'd have to say il mio gatto. The exception is when the noun is a family member, then you can leave it out, but even then there are some caveats. Now it's time for the super quick section on Italian numbers, so here's 1 through 10. Only one, un, uno, or una inflects for gender. The rest of them stay put. Numbers also don't affect the pluralization of their nouns. If the noun is plural, it'll be inflected as such. In 2-digit numbers, the tens place goes first, and the two numbers combine rather smoothly in my opinion. The numbers 11 through 16, on the other hand, are formed with the ones place first, followed by dici, whereas 17 through 19 do the opposite and revert back to the 20 and above system. And finally, the ordinal numbers look like this. They're a bit removed from their cardinal forms, but still generally recognizable outside of primo and secondo. So let's talk about adjectives, which should be pretty familiar. Italian adjectives inflect for gender and number, so here, for example, is the chart for alto. The suffixes exactly match those of the corresponding nouns, as the feminine form is alta and the plural forms are alti for masculine and alte for feminine. One thing to note here is that if an adjective ends in chi, that chi will become soft in the masculine plural but stay hard and add the h in the feminine plural, like in selvatico, which becomes masculine plural selvatici but feminine plural selvatiche. Same rule applies to nouns, by the way. However, there are also some adjectives ending with e in the singular that don't agree for gender, and they end with e in the plural, like felice becoming felici. No gender information needed. Forming adverbs from adjectives is pretty easy in Italian. You just take the feminine singular form and add the suffix mente, so highly is altamente and happily is felicemente. The two main exceptions are, of course, good, which is buono as an adjective, and bene as an adverb, and bad, which is respectively cattivo and male. Okay, well, there is the adjective malo, but it's now archaic in Italian. You can also put the suffix issimo on an adjective to make it vary that adjective, and that's it. So now we're on to verbs. Italian has 3 verb classes, those being are, ere, and ire. Well, there's also technically urre, but that's a very marginal verb class that historically belongs with the ire verbs. So under the summary of the things Italian verbs get conjugated for, there are 4 moods: indicative, subjunctive, conditional, and imperative. The indicative mood pretty much just indicates the real situation. It's the most basic one. Then the subjunctive, or as it's called in Italian, the conjunctive, is specifically for verbs after the basic conjunction che, meaning that, when the verb represents something uncertain to happen. There's a whole list of situations to use it in, but just remember, it expresses doubt. Then the conditional is used when something would happen under certain conditions, and the imperative is used to give commands. As for tenses and aspects, they're kind of mixed together. In the indicative mood, there's the present, referring to stuff happening now, the imperfect, used for actions in the past that were ongoing or habitual, and the future tense. But now you may be wondering why I didn't mention the past tense with a perfective aspect, things that either happened once or had a clear start and end. Well, Italian used to have that. It was called the preterite, now it's called the past historic, and it looked like this. But now, that role has been transferred to the present perfect, or passato prossimo, which is a compound tense formed from the appropriately conjugated form of avere, meaning have, followed by the passive participle of the verb. It's the same formula used by all those other languages in the standard average European Sprachbund that do it. Well, except for reflexive or intransitive verbs where the auxiliary verb is instead essere, meaning be. You can also form other perfect tense aspects if you put the auxiliary verb in a different tense or mood, like if you're saying that something had happened, will have happened, would have happened, you get the point. Anyway, the subjunctive only has 2 of these tenses, the present and imperfect, while the other 2 moods each have only 1, ignoring the auxiliary verbs, which we'll talk more about later. So now let's do some conjugating. The regular verbs that I'll use as examples will be ascoltare for the are verbs, vendere for the ere verbs, and dormire for the ire verbs. We'll start with the indicative present, so here's ascoltare. Pretty typical of a Romance language, we got 3 people and 2 numbers. One thing to note is that the third person plural conjugation ascoltano has the stress on the antepenultimate syllable, not the penultimate like the rest of the conjugations. This is something that really threw me off when I was learning Italian. Now before I move on to the next verb, I'm gonna highlight these 3 boxes. Now here's vendere. Did you catch it? Yep, those 3 forms change their suffix depending on the verb class, known as the thematic suffixes, since they match the infinitive. It's almost the same arrangement with dormire, but the second person plural conjugation is a bit different. So now on to the indicative imperfect, which is pretty easy. You take the root of the verb plus the vowel from the infinitive suffix, then you add v and whichever suffix is appropriate for the personal agreement. Here's ascoltare, vendere, dormire. The indicative future tense is also fairly light work, although it's formed off the infinitive verb instead of the root, and there's one caveat. Here's vendere and here's dormire, which behave perfectly according to what I just described. Now here's ascoltare. Yeah, I'll listen is ascolterò with an E instead of an A. No idea why that happens. So now that we're on to the subjunctive present, remember when I was talking about the thematic suffixes in the indicative present? Well, for the subjunctive, you'll use the athematic suffixes, the opposite of the vowel used in the infinitive. Therefore, ascoltare becomes ascolti in the subjunctive for all singular conjugations, vendere becomes venda in those places, and dormire becomes dorma. And for the subjunctive imperfect, we're back to thematic, but at least there's a cool suffix involved, si or se. Here's ascoltare, vendere, dormire. So now for the conditional mood, here's ascoltare. You'll see it's basically the same system as on the indicative future, but this time the suffixes are a bit more eccentric with like ascolteresti, ascolterebbe, and the like. Here's vendere and dormire. And finally, for the full conjugations, there's the imperative mood. It's a bit of a mix between the thematic and athematic suffixes, as if you're doing the formal thing and referring to someone in the third person, in both singular and plural you use the athematic suffix, but otherwise it's the thematic suffix. Also, for second person singular commands specifically, there's a difference between positive and negative commands. Positive commands, as mentioned, just have the thematic suffix, but for negative commands you say non followed by the infinitive verb, so don't listen is non ascoltare. By the way, yes, this is how you negate any verb in Italian, you put non before it. Here's vendere and dormire in the imperative. So now we can talk about compound tenses and how to form them. Since we've already addressed how to form the passato prossimo when something happened once in the past, all that's left to do for that is explain how to make a passive participle. Basically, are verbs get the suffix ato, like with ascoltato. It's a similar story with the other regular verbs like vendere becoming venduto and dormire becoming dormito, but I should mention that ere and ire verbs have a very high chance of being irregular, especially on the passive participle, which is something we'll discuss shortly. So then the other thing to talk about here is the progressive constructions, as like some of the other languages in the area, Italian can form a compound progressive aspect indicating that the action is ongoing. It's made from the appropriately conjugated form of stare, meaning stand, followed by the gerund of the action verb. You form that by adding the suffix ando to an are verb or endo to an ere or ire verb. Here are some examples. And in case you're wondering, yes, stare is a cognate of the Spanish, Portuguese, and Catalan verb estar, which I pronounce in Spanish for convenience, used in the same constructions, but unlike those languages, in Italian, outside of this one very specific context, stare never means be. It's not in a tandem with essere. Speaking of essere, let's talk about irregular verbs now. As you'd expect, essere is super weird. The forms are from various roots starting with e, esse, and effe, and the passive participle actually comes from the aforementioned stare. Also be aware that sono means both I am and they are, but you'll probably be able to distinguish them from context. Stare itself is also irregular, though not nearly to the degree of essere. The main deviation from the norm is in the future inconditional, where it becomes starò and starai instead of stero and sterai like you'd expect. And since we've already talked about avere, here it is. The vast majority of its forms are pretty weird, but at least you'll learn the present tense forms super quickly from using them all the time. And yes, some of them have silent h. And here's andare, which is suppleted in the present. Now for a pair of verbs that behave similarly, first let's look at tenere. Pretty much all irregular except the imperfects, which is a theme you'll notice in irregular Italian verbs. Likewise, here's venire, same story pretty much. And look at the future in particular because this sort of pattern also occurs on a few other verbs. Next up is dire, which adds an etymological chi in several places. There are also a few verbs that add esse in certain forms, most notably capire in the present tenses, but notice how that cluster changes pronunciation depending on the following vowel. I understand is capisco, but you understand is capisci. Same applies for dire, by the way, it was just easier to explain here. Fare also does something like that. After that, there's sapere, which is especially weird in the present tense. You should also be aware that some verbs like udire change their root vowel when that syllable is stressed. Now I'll end the irregular verbs by stating that there are many ere and ire verbs that are regular everywhere except in the passive participle. And to finish the whole verb section, we'll circle back to the infinitives because there's an interesting quirk that happens when a pronoun gets added to the end of them. The e disappears. For example, hide transitive, as in hide something else, is nascondere, but the reflexive form, meaning hide yourself, is nascondersi. So now for the section about other stuff that didn't fit anywhere previous, we'll talk about the Italian adverbial pronouns. If you've seen the French language overview, it's more or less the same thing. In Italian, they're ci and ne, and they're used for missing information about location, destination, or general origin. For example, if someone asks you, sei venuto dalla spiaggia? Did you come from the beach? You can't just say, sì, sono venuto. Yeah, I came, because Italian grammar says you left out the origin. So you'd instead have to say, sì, ne sono venuto. Yeah, I came from there. So yeah, ne is the one that indicates general movement from a place, or sometimes a part of something, like in ne voglio, I want some of it. Whatever it is should have been indicated earlier in the conversation. Also note that that sentence doesn't mean I don't want. As mentioned, that would use non, but I feel like ne may confuse some people into thinking it's the negative particle. So for the other adverbial pronoun ci, it indicates either atness or to-ness, like in ci sto pensando, I'm thinking about it. It also has a formal variety, vi. Alright, now we'll do the standard example sentences at the end here. The first one is disegno rane volanti nel mio taccuino. This means I draw flying frogs in my notebook. To start, disegno is the first person singular indicative present conjugation of disegnare, the are verb meaning draw, perfectly regular. Then we have rane volanti. Rane is the plural form of rana, the feminine noun meaning frog, while volanti is the plural of volante, the active adjective form of the verb volare meaning fly, so flying, and the ending is e because the singular form ended with e. Gender is irrelevant in this case. I didn't have a convenient place to explain active participles, which are different from gerunds in the verb section, so basically it's ante for are verbs and ente for ere and ire verbs. Finally, nel mio taccuino. Nel is a contraction of in, the preposition meaning in, and il, the masculine singular definite article, and it's required before the possessive pronoun in Italian. That's mio, which is also masculine and singular, all to match with the masculine noun taccuino, meaning notebook. The other example sentence is non aprire la porta al forno quando che tu sia malata. This means don't open the oven door when you're sick. First up, there's that interesting arrangement where to give one person a negative command, you use the negative particle non followed by the infinitive verb, in this case aprire, the ire verb meaning open. Then there's the feminine singular definite article la for the feminine noun porta meaning door. After that, we have another example of a contraction, this time al, which is the preposition a meaning to, followed by again il, which now goes with the noun forno meaning oven. So that whole noun phrase is technically the door to the oven. After that, we have a subjunctive phrase. Quando is the conjunction meaning when, and it's followed by che, also a conjunction to introduce the subjunctive verb. That's sia, the subjunctive present conjugation of essere, the super irregular copula verb. Now, even though I didn't really need to, I included the subject pronoun tu in the sentence because, as you can see on this chart, it's a bit ambiguous when singular. And finally, we have the adjective malata, meaning sick, and it's feminine, so we know that the listener of this sentence is female. To finish the video, è possibilmente vero che originalmente apprendevo italiano per poter meglio leggere i menù nei ristoranti italiani, però l'ho usato molto più che pensavo. Italiano è una lingua conosciuta per la sua bellezza e, bene, il suo suono rimbalzante, e nel mondo non possiamo ignorarlo. Puoi trovarlo dalla musica alla cucina e ovunque altro, e ciò che è molto comodo è che non conoscevo molti italiani quando iniziavo a apprendere italiano, ma nel tempo d'allora una cugina lontana mia si è sposata con un italiano. Allora adesso parlo italiano molti anni nel giorno del ringraziamento negli Stati Uniti con lui, i loro figli e i suoi genitori. Le lingue sono a volte così divertenti. Spero che vi piacesse il video, cliccate mi piace e iscrivetevi e grazie per aver guardato.